Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Es wolle uns Gott gnädig sein, which translates to May God be gracious to us. This is a pretty long chorale. All things considered, the chorale looks a lot longer than it actually is because really these first four phrases are kind of like an A section that consists of a repeat, but there are some differences between them. Just a couple of differences between them, which means that they take up more real estate on the page. So we have this small three-system chorale, or when I say small, I mean small formatted wise chorale today to fit it all on one page, which I did manage to do without too much trouble. But you might have to zoom in a little bit in order to see some of my handwriting, so apologies for that. Regardless, we should hop into the analysis because this is kind of a longer one. Two sharps in the key signature. We start on F sharp major and we end on D major, so there's another disagreement between the key of the chorale and the final cadence. I think it's pretty clear that we start in the key of B minor, but we end in the key of D major. They share a key signature, so, at least there's that in comparison to some of the chorales we've looked at recently where the key signature doesn't agree with the key of the chorale, which is particularly interesting. But here we have B minor and D major. They're relative major and minor to one another. So we're starting off with F sharp major. That is a 5 chord. That's our dominant. We then move to B, B, F sharp, and D, which is B minor in root position, which is our tonic. Then we get F sharp, A sharp, F sharp, and C sharp with the passing 7th in the alto. It's another 5 chord, so we have a 5-1-5 progression so far. And looking ahead to our first cadence, we actually don't cadence in the key of B minor, we cadence in the key of A major, so we're looking for a point in which we modulate to the key of A major, and I'm calling this an imperfect authentic cadence, even though it has some half cadential qualities to it. But regardless, it's kind of one of those hybrid cadences where the sound may not agree with what is exactly going in on the page or going on the page. But here we have G sharp, B, D, and B, this is G natural, G, B, D, and B. That is G major in root position. That is a 6 chord, and interestingly enough, I think we go to A major, not through B minor, but through D major, and I think there is a brief recess to D major before we get to A major, which to be honest makes a little bit more sense movement wise, even though Bach does go to the flat 7 in minor keys without introduction or without a mediant key. I should be careful with the terms I use because the D has nothing to do with the mediant in the key of B minor. D is the mediant of B minor. What I mean to say is an intermediary key that brings one key to the next. He often goes from minor to the key of the flat 7, or in this case A major, but he seems to do so through D major before we go to A major. That was very long-winded, apologies for that. But G major also happens to be the subdominant in the key of D major. And then we have F sharp, A, and C sharp, which is a 3 chord in root position. We have a couple of passing tones as well, which kind of turns us into a 1-6-4 chord as well. F sharp, B, A, and D, or a 1-4-3 chord, I guess, because of that A in there. So I don't think it's really worth analyzing, but kind of what's going on the page. We then have E, C sharp, G sharp, and E. That is C sharp diminished in first inversion, or C sharp diminished over E. I think that's our 7-6. 3 going to 7 is not super uncommon, even though it's more common for 4 to go to 7. But then we have D, D, F sharp, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad, but without the 5th, so it's kind of interesting. I think this is also where we modulate to the key of A major, because we get F sharp, G sharp, and A. This A major fragment here in the alto is telling. So we'll call this this D major chord now 4 in the key of A, before we get C sharp, E, A, and E, which is A major in root position, in first inversion. But before we move on, we have G sharp, D, D, and F sharp, which is kind of like a passing 7-4-3 chord. That makes sense after 4. And because this would be a diminished quality chord, the third doesn't matter as much, even though the third is often present in these passing 7 chords that we get with Bach. It's interesting with this progression though, because we're seeing it in second inversion. But then we get another passing tone here in the tenor before we get B, G sharp, B, and D, which is G sharp diminished over B. That's another 7-6 chord. And this progression is one that we see often, 1-6-7-6 to 1, A, C sharp, E, and C sharp, an imperfect authentic cadence because the tonic is not in the melody. Okay, moving along, we have a phrase that ends with an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, but that's not before we revisit the key of B minor. We start off with A sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and E, which is F sharp 7 over A sharp. That's a 5-6-5 chord. And then we have B, B, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic triad, which is where we expect 5-6-5 to go. Passing 7th in the tenor, and then we get E, G, E, and C sharp. That is a C sharp diminished chord over E sharp, which would be 2-6 in the key of B minor. But in the key of D major, it also happens to be 7-6. So we're seeing that diminished chord repurposed as a common chord. And then we get D, A, F sharp, and D, which is great because that's where we would expect C sharp diminished to go. We then get G, B, D, and B. That is G major in root position. That's a 4 chord. And then we have C sharp and E here, which kind of takes this chord and turns it into a passing 7-4-3 chord. Again, we've seen this before, 4 going to 7-4-3. However, this time it's a fully voiced 7-4-3 chord as opposed to one that lacks a fifth, or a third, apologies. But then we get F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, which is a D major, F sharp, D, F sharp, and A. That's a D major chord in first inversion. We then get B, D, F sharp, and F sharp. That is B minor in root position. That's a 6 chord with a passing tone in the melody. And then we get A, F sharp, and A. A, D, F sharp, and A. I always get my clefs mixed up. I'm used to tenor reading in bass clef, but I'm used to reading chorales with 2 voices in the bass clef, so I often mix the tenor up, even though when I'm singing from a score, I'd much rather read from treble clef. I think that comes from me being a guitar player, but this would be a D major triad in second inversion, so a 1-6-4 chord, before we go to A, E, and G, which would be an incomplete A7 chord. We know that 5/7 is being implied here, but there's no C in the chord, which is really interesting. We would expect there to be the C sharp to contextualize the chord. But then we have D, A, D, and F sharp. And remember, F sharp in the melody makes it imperfect authentic. We would need a D in the melody to make it a perfect authentic. All right, next phrase, we see something akin to the first phrase, where we are in the key of B minor and we move to the key of A major through D major in a similar fashion, but this would be an imperfect authentic cadence with kind of half cadential qualities as well, but I think it's an imperfect authentic cadence if I had to choose one label over the other. So again, kind of a direct modulation to B minor. You could say that this D is a common chord, but it doesn't really feel tangential. This feels like a new idea. So we have C sharp, A sharp, E, and C sharp. One of the reasons why we can't have a repeat here, unfortunately, even though the melody is very similar, it is a slight harmonic variation of the melody, even though the harmonies are more or less functioning the same. This would be A sharp diminished over C sharp, which is 7-6 in the key of B minor, and then we get B, B, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. Then we have F sharp, F sharp, and C sharp, which is our root position F sharp major triad, which is 5, passing 7th in the alto, and then we get G, B, D, and B, which is G major in root position, which is a 6 chord. We get a deceptive progression just like the first phrase, and just like the first phrase, we are moving to the key of D major before we go to A major through this G major chord, which is 4 in the key of D major. We then get F sharp, A, and C sharp, so another sort of deceptive progression. We would expect maybe 1 after this, but we get 3 in root position, which is interesting. Then we have some passing tones going on in the tenor and the melody before we get B, F sharp, and D, which is a 6 chord in the key of, B, F sharp. Oh, I skipped a system. What am I doing? I'm like, that's not the same. E, C sharp, G, and E, which is C sharp diminished in root position, first inversion, 7/6, in the key of D major. And that goes to D major, D, D, F sharp, and F sharp. Same incomplete D major chord, which in the key of A is also 4. And then we get this passing G sharp, which makes G sharp, D, D, and F sharp, which would be 7 instead of 4/3. Did I analyze that wrong earlier? Yeah, no, it is a 4/3 chord because the B would have to be in the bass for it to be a 6/5 chord. No, this is a 7/4/3 chord. Before we get C sharp, E, A, and E, which is our tonic triad, A major in first inversion, passing tone in the tenor. Before we get B, G sharp, D, and D, which is G sharp diminished over B. That's 7/6. And as we would expect afterwards, we get a tonic triad in root position, A sharp, C sharp, E, and C sharp. Root position, 1/6, 7/6, 1, very normative progression in Bach's music. And then we get the complement to that same first phrase with a repeat of the second phrase. So I'm calling it a direct modulation to B major. You could force a perspective of a common chord onto it. It just does not sound like a common chord. And besides, there is a rest that separates these two phrases anyways. So here we get A sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and E. That's F sharp 7 over A sharp. That's 5/6/5. Before we get B, B, F sharp, and D. Root position B minor triad. Passing 7th in the tenor. E, G, E, and C sharp. That's C sharp diminished over E, which would be 2/6 in the key of B minor. I think we're in the key of D major at this point. And this is also 7/6. As you can see, I'm basically reanalyzing the first phrase here. D, A, F sharp, and D. That's our root position D major chord, which is our tonic. We then have G, B, D, and B. Root position G major triad, which is 4. Then we get these passing tones, which spells out a C sharp, E, G, and B chord, which is 7/4/3 again. We've seen this progression twice before. Then we have F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, which is a D major triad in first inversion, which is our tonic. And then we have B, D, F sharp, and F sharp, which is a root position B minor triad, passing tone in the melody, A, D, F sharp, and A. That's a D major triad in second inversion. We're getting ready for a cadence anyways, which is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. We then get A, E, and G, incomplete 5/7 chord without the third, which is particularly uncommon. But regardless, we know the 5/7's being implied because of the 7th. Otherwise, we would know the quality of the triad, but we have expectations, and we kind of audibly fill in the gap before we get a D major chord, D, A, D, and F sharp. And it also adds to the quaintness of the fact that this is an imperfect authentic cadence. There's always something about the imperfect authentic cadence in addition to the non-tonic chord tone being in the melody, and it's just there's something wonky about the chords, whether it's the inversion of the chords, what predominants are being used. There's always something that throws the imperfect authentic cadence for a loop, some more jarring than others. I would say this is on more of the jarring side because we're missing a third and a major triad, which is interesting. It's kind of oxymoronic, right? It's like if you have a major triad without a third, how do you know it's a major triad? Well, we know it's a major triad through context, but literally on the page and what's being heard, it's an open fifth with a minor 7th. So we know it's implied. All right, next cadence is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. No modulation in this phrase. So we have D, A, F sharp, and A. That's another D major triad. Then we have C sharp, A, E, and G. This D being a suspension, a lower suspension. It could be like a 5/6 or even a 9/10 suspension in the bass. It's actually kind of being there are multiple different suspensions. There's like 4/5 going on, 5/6, 9/10. lower suspensions are interesting in that way. But here we have C sharp, A, E, and G, which is A7 over C sharp, that's 5/6. And then we have D, A, D, and F sharp. We expect the first inversion 5 chord to go to 1. That goes to A, D, and E. This D being a 4/3 suspension over the bass is another 5 chords, an A, major triad, and root position. And then we get D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad again. We have a passing tone in the bass as well. Then we get F sharp, A, D, and D, which is just inverting the major triad into first inversion. We then get E, B, G, and E, and I think we'd be tempted to call this a 2 chord, but I think it's more likely that in a cadential situation, this C sharp is our chord tone, so C sharp, E, G, and E. It's probably a 7/6 chord, I think, even though both chords are kind of doing the same thing and the chords are very similar to one another. That leading tone changes the function of the chord from predominant to dominant. And then that 7/6 chord goes to a root position D major triad, D, F sharp, A, and F sharp. Again, 1/6, 7/6, 1. We've seen it a ton of times here in this chorale in particular, but also throughout a lot of Bach's vocal music. All right, looking ahead to the next cadence, it is a half cadence. It's our first purely half cadence in the chorale, and it is in the key of D major again, so no modulation yet, but we're going to get one soon. If not in the next phrase, the phrase afterwards. So we're in D major land for a while, which is the key of the chorale anyway, so we would expect there to be emphasis of the tonic key, especially after avoiding it in the, I guess we're calling it the A section. Here we have C sharp, E, A, and C sharp, which is A major in first inversion, that's 5/6. And then we get D, D, A, and D, which is an interesting chord because we would expect there to be a 1 chord here, which I'm going to call it a 1 chord, but it doesn't have a third, same way that we haven't had thirds in these A chords. It's kind of interesting just to have an open fifth here. Very curious. But here we have E, G, G, and C sharp. That is a 7/6 chord, C sharp diminished over E, with a passing 7th in the melody. And then we get F sharp, D, F sharp, A, which is D major in first inversion, with a couple of passing tones in the lower voices before we get D, F sharp, and B, which is a little bit of a deceptive progression. We might expect the tonic triad to be inverted or rotated back to root position, but this B getting introduced here changes the quality of the chord to 6/6, which is B minor over D. And we get some passing tones in the outer voices as well. We have B, F sharp, and D, which interestingly we seldom see consecutive 6 chords, but that's pretty cool that we're seeing them here. This is taking the 6 chord and just putting it in root position, and usually I would just change the figured bass, but because we're on a new system, I'm just going to reanalyze the chord, because your eye has to jump a pretty large distance. If this were here, I would just change the figured bass, but that's just the way that I format the analysis for legibility. So it looks like we have 2 non-chord tones here, but they actually belong to the chord. D and B are both chord tones in B minor. We then get E, B, B, and E. E, B, B, and E. These open fifths in this chorale are particularly interesting, so I think what is being implied here is a root position 2 chord, especially considering that E minor is usually something that's followed by 5. And then we get A, E, A, and C sharp, which is a 5 chord. So the fact that we have an incomplete triad here, or the fact that we have incomplete triads anywhere, is very interesting. And the fact that they're consistent across the chorale as well seems to me that Bach is doing this intentionally, and it'd be interesting to see whether or not this is a nod to another harmonization he's aware of, or maybe there's some type of metaphor behind it. Who knows? But regardless, we end our next phrase with an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. We have D, D, A, and F sharp, which is a root position D major triad. We have A, C sharp, A, and E, which is a root position A major triad. That's 5. Non-chord tone where we leap up to F sharp here in the tenor, which is kind of interesting. Then we get A, E, A, and C sharp, which is a root position 5 chord. We have some passing tones going on in 3 of the voices. That's B, D, A, and D. So kind of a 6-7 chord going on, but I don't think it's really worth analyzing, just something to note. Here we have C sharp, E, and E, which kind of hard to analyze. We don't know exactly what's going on. We could say that this is in the key of D major, a 7 chord. I think it's more likely that this is 5-6, because 5 going to 7 is relatively uncommon, especially in root position. But we have passing tones in the bass and the alto, which kind of spell a D major triad, D and F sharp, but with the rest of the voices, that's definitely more implied than literal. But here we have E, B, G, and B, which would be a root position E minor triad. 5 going to 2 is kind of interesting, again with those passing tones that we had on the previous offbeat going in the opposite direction. Here we have C sharp, E, E, and A, which is an A major triad in first inversion. It's 5-6. Neighbor tones in the alto and the bass again, before we get C sharp, A, E, and G, which is taking the chord and putting it, adding a 7th, so we'll just change it to 6-5. And technically on this and here it turns into 5-3, because the third, which is in the bass, drops down to root here. So, and when we do that, we actually get the same kind of A7 chord that we get here. A, E, and G. A, E, and G. It's interesting that it's seeing a resurgence, and he corrects it right before the final chord in the cadence, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad. Alright, next phrase is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of B minor, but we go to B minor through A major. So I think actually what happens is we get A, C sharp, and E here, which is a 5 chord. That can be recontextualized as 1 in the key of A major, with a passing 7th in the bass, before you get F sharp, A, C sharp, and A. That's F sharp minor in root position. That's a 6 chord. We get E, E, G sharp, and B. It's a root position 5 chord, E major. Passing tones, F sharp, or passing F sharps in the alto and the bass, and a neighboring D here, which kind of turns this into B minor over F sharp, but I don't really think that's super important. And this actually is another interesting progression. I think this E major chord is actually our common chord to the key of B minor, and we know that Bach uses 4 as a common chord in minor keys as well. It's, I don't know, depending on how you look at it. I look at it as a harmonization of the melodic minor scale, but there might be some modal influence as well. The juxtaposition of G sharp and G natural as tones in the bass kind of makes it feel like a modal minor or like a modal Dorian a little bit as well. Because we're not seeing A sharp so much in the bass yet, but we eventually do. But after that 4 chord, we get G, E, E, and C sharp, which would be C sharp diminished over G, which might be the case. It might be a 2-6-4 chord. Or, the way that I prefer to look at it, is G, D, F sharp, and D. And where else did we see a G, D, F sharp chord before? We saw here G sharp, D, D, and F sharp. Here we're seeing 2 Ds, a G, and an F sharp. We're seeing a very similar chord, but the only difference between the two is G natural and G sharp. So the fact that that's recurring, maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not. But I'm going to call this a 6-7 chord. And I think 4 going to 6 is more likely than 4 going to 2-6-4, especially if the 2-6-4 is leaping this diminished 7th here from A sharp to G natural, or other way around, G natural to A sharp. It's a hard interval to sing, but it is pretty tonal. Flat 6 going to raise 7th is pretty tonal. Here we have A sharp, C sharp, G, and E. Also makes more sense for 6 to go to 7 rather than for 2 to go to 7. This would be a fully diminished 7th chord in root position in the key of B minor. And then we get, of course, B minor afterwards. B, C sharp, F sharp, and D. The C sharp being an accented non-chord tone, or a 9/8 suspension over the bass, however you look at it. But it's still a tonic triad. We get F sharp, C sharp, B, and C sharp. This B being a 4/3 suspension over the bass. This is really a 5 chord that turns into a 5/7 on this beat here before we cadence on B minor, B, D, F sharp, and B. And if I'm not mistaken, this is our first perfect authentic cadence in the key of B minor, as we prepare for our final phrase, which ends with a perfect authentic cadence, or sorry, not a perfect authentic cadence, an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. It's interesting to end on an imperfect authentic cadence. I almost wrote perfect authentic just because it's such a force of habit at this point, because you expect a chorale to end on a perfect authentic cadence. Albeit recently we've seen a plagal cadence, and sometimes we've seen half cadences, but the vast majority of the time we expect a perfect authentic cadence. But before we modulate to the key of D major, I think we briefly visit A major, and we have a little bit of a 2-5-1. Bach would have definitely been a jazz guy. We have a brief visit to the key of A major here, B minor being our 2, G sharp, E, B, and D being E7 over G sharp, that's 5-6-5, before we go to A, E, A, and C sharp, this D being a 4/3 suspension over the bass, or sorry, B, A, being a 7/6 suspension over the bass. That is a 2-5-1 in the key of A major, pretty cool. And then here we have D major, or modulation to the key of D major, that is. We have A major, which is now 5, going to B, D, A, and D, which is not 6-7, but rather G, B, D, and B, which is G major, which in first inversion, which would be 4-6. 5 going to 4-6 is a take on the deceptive progression, because we have 5 going to 6 in the bass, but the chord harmonized on top of it is a 4 chord rather than a 6 chord. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. We have C sharp, E, G, and A, which would be an A7 chord in first inversion, 5-6-5. And then this F is a little passing tone. The rest of the chord notes are chord tones. And then we get D, A, D, and F sharp, which is where we expect 5-6-5 to go. It's where we've seen 5-6-5 go in the past to 1. We get some passing tones in the outer voices. And then we get F sharp, D, D, and A. That's a D major triad in first inversion. Some passing tones in the tenor, or sorry, the bass and the alto, before we get A, D, F sharp, and A. Second inversion, D major triad. Makes sense. We've seen this figure before. Root position, first inversion, second inversion, as we get ready for the cadence. Then we get A, D, E, and G here, but really what's implied is 5-7. It just doesn't resolve until beat 4. This is a 6-4 going to a 5-7, and here it's complete as opposed to the incomplete variants that we've seen in the other D major cadences in the A section. Here, 1-6-4, incomplete 5-7, 1-6-4, incomplete 5-7, before we cadence on 1. Imperfect authentic cadence, interestingly enough. We would typically end on a D in the melody, but we don't get that. We get F sharp, which is pretty interesting. And that was our mammoth of a chorale for today. This was not the longest video actually, but still a marathon, because the chorale more or less functioned harmonically, so I was able to breeze through it, but still there was a lot of real estate, so I breezed relatively quickly, but it was still an objectively long chorale because of that A section that could have just been a repeat if Bach just wrote this as a 5 chord rather than a 7-6 chord. But that being said, I'll cap the analysis off there. Thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for continuing to support the channel. It means the world to me. The fact that this video, this channel is like taking off and people are actually watching the videos makes me so happy. I started this journey for myself, and the fact that other people are enjoying it as well. Maybe I'm helping you with your homework. Maybe you're just a fan of Bach's music and you're trying to get your fingertips on some some more theory. I'm happy to help in any way that I can. This is a learning experience for me too, and as much as I enjoy analysis, I'm just happy that I can share that with you all who are watching the video today. So again, thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in analysis and following me along on this journey, if you catch me while I'm still on this journey, feel free to subscribe. I upload a video every day with a chorale harmonization analysis. We're currently on episode 120, and there are like another 300 chorale harmonizations, so there are lots of videos scheduled for the future, so stay tuned. Maybe hit the notification bell if you're interested in getting notifications. If not, there is many hours of content to catch up on if you're starting right now, so please join me on this journey. It's been a really wonderful time, and I hope to catch you in the next video. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you take care.